So this will be the introduction to Chapter 7 on fraud, internal control, and cash. And basically I organized the chapter into 4 parts. The first part is going to be your learning objectives 1 through 4, and this is all on the principles of internal control. The second clump of information, that I do is the learning objective 5, which is petty cash, how to run a petty cash account. Then I do 6 and 7 together as a unit, and that's on the bank reconciliation. And then the last is learning objective 8 on the reporting of cash. So that's how you'll see the information organized on Blackboard, and I based the sort of the homework and the videos and everything else on that grouping of the information. So why learn about internal control? First of all, there's a couple of reasons. Financial self-defense is the first one. In the U.S., companies lose about $1 trillion every single year. That's just U.S. companies, or 7% of their total revenues, to fraud and employee theft. Okay? So if you're taking an accounting course, you're in the business program, presumably you're going to run your own business. Do you want to be part of the employers who lose some of that $1 trillion? Probably not. Also, if you're working for another company, you may be a manager who is in charge of or responsible for some company assets, and you don't want them to go walking off the premises on your watch. So personally, it's good to have an understanding of these principles of internal control. The other reason is the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, which is mentioned in your book. This was legislation passed after the financial crisis of 2002, or 2001, I guess. And it really mandates that companies listed on the stock exchanges, that's the large publicly traded companies, must have a system of internal controls. Management has to report on them every time they, along with their financial statements, as part of their financial statements that come out annually. Management has to attest. They have to say, yes, we have internal controls, and this is how well they're working. As part of Sarbanes-Oxley, accountants or auditors who go in and audit these big firms also have to file a separate report and attesting to how well the internal controls of that company are working. This was all as a result of Enron, WorldCom, a bunch of other, accounting fiascos. If you're working for a large company, or you end up at one of these, larger accounting firms, you'll need to know a lot more about Sarbanes-Oxley. But what if you're just running your own little business, working locally? How big a deal is it to know these things? Well, I have a friend, John, who's an accountant. He works at probably a regional, mid-sized accounting firm. And according to him, about 10 to 15% more time is spent on auditing and, working with small businesses to help them with their systems of internal control. The principles of internal control make a lot of sense. If you, want to safeguard your own assets, it makes sense to know how to do that. So these principles, while they may not be required as part of your reporting, they're definitely recommended, and a lot of the things that are required of the large companies tend to trickle down to the small companies. So there is a lot of good reasons to know about what's in the chapter. Okay, so how this is actually set up. I guess learning objectives 1 through 4 I lump together. Learning objective 1 is defining internal control. That's always good to know. What is it? The second one is the principles of internal control. And the text does a very good job on these items. especially the principles of internal control. So I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to leave you to get that from the text. And if you want to listen to, you know, videos on Wiley Plus, I'm sure they've got some good ones there. But they give real-world examples, and they, you know, they really do an adequate job. Learning Objective 3 takes these 6 principles of internal control and applies them specifically to cash receipts, cash received by the company. How do we handle that? Learning Objective 4 applies them specifically to cash disbursements, cash payments the company makes. Because, and they put the emphasis on cash because that's the most common asset to be stolen by employees. Then we get to, so that's the clump of material we'll be dealing with in this section. And then, you know, in the next section you'll do, you know, petty cash, which is a technique, a method of applying internal control to the specific cash disbursements of, you know, the small cash disbursements associated with petty cash. Learning Objective 6 and 7 also relate to cash in general, both disbursements and receipts, you know, in how, you know, the bank account helps as an internal control mechanism, and especially the bank reconciliation. And then, you know, Learning Objective 8 is the reporting of cash. Okay, so how do you really want to learn this? You know, take it personally. How does internal control apply to you? You know, think about your own cash, your own assets, and apply each internal control principle to that. And actually, even better, you've probably, most of you, worked somewhere at this point. So take a company that you have actually worked at and take each internal control principle and say, gee, how does this apply? Do they do this at my company? How well do they do this? Is it working? And so to take it personally, you know, really is, it's a better way to learn something than to try and just memorize different principles and not have them applied to anything you know about. Okay, so now if you are actually running a business or are planning to soon, in the Learning Objectives 1 through 4 section on Blackboard, the last item is called Extras, Internal Control. This takes you into more information if you want it. It's optional, not on the test, but it takes you into the real world of how to actually set up an internal control system. It's the, I think one item I have in there is the Security and Exchange Commission's Guide for Small Business on Internal Control. So if you would like more, you know, that just takes you a little beyond. Okay, so your next stop would be to go to the Learning Objectives 1 through 4 section and, you know, do the reading, listen to the podcast, or look at the notes, or look at the podcasts on, you know, Wiley Plus. And so that's where you go next.